Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's session on peer-to-peer learning. My name is Amy Stalker, and I'm from Georgia State University. I'm joined today by two of my colleagues, Angela Dixon and Kristina Lang. We are here today to share about our experiences with peer-to-peer learning and tell you about how we are adapting it in a variety of ways to develop new skills and knowledge, as well as bolster our existing skill sets. You will note a link on the next slide. We have created a guide that shares resources and working examples of some of our sandboxing projects. The entire presentation slide deck will also be nested there at the end of the conference. First, a little background information. We all work at the Dunwoody campus of Georgia State, which means that our primary focus is serving students completing their first 2 years of college, as well as students who might be returning to school to make a career shift or change. This means that we do a lot of everything, and like many of you, our roles require us to be ready for anything at any time. Not surprisingly, this means that we eagerly seek out lots of different types of training and development opportunities in a wide variety of topics. Prior to COVID-19, during a few of the slower times in a semester, we kicked around a couple of small-scale projects that served as the launch for what we now refer to as sandboxing. Obviously, things changed dramatically last year when COVID set in, and we were forced to very quickly pivot to accelerate our team's virtual skills to prepare for at least ending the semester online. Joke was on us that we thought it would be a couple of months at the most. At that time, sandboxing immediately came to mind, given the virtual environment we found ourselves in. We continue to expand our use of this technique and are always looking for new ways and new excuses to use this approach. We hope you can take some of what we are doing and use it to the same success with your teams and with your own situations. Before we get into the specifics of where we've been and where we're headed, I'd like to share our definition of sandbox. When we use sandbox as a verb, we are talking about team-driven learning that involves self-directed tasks, group discovery at one or more points in the process, and the critical piece of sharing and processing as a team. Our process is situational and driven by our interests and needs. This could include developing specific finished projects, such as teaching and learning objects for instruction, trying new tech platforms or tools, learning or relearning about our library's existing content and resources, and building intermediate to advanced skills with tools we already have and use. Kristina is going to share what we've done under the broad umbrella of technology.
Our technology sandbox sessions let us explore the mechanics of many different kinds of tech tools. We sandbox the conferencing applications Cisco WebEx and Microsoft Teams. This was an example of working with software that we had access to and had already used, but because of COVID constraints, we needed to use a lot more and/or in different ways. For WebEx, utilizing functions in a private group sandbox session gave us the space to explore the functionality of things like breakout rooms, polling, and switching access between presenters and speakers. This type of sandboxing helped us to anticipate real-life obstacles and tech difficulties before we went live in the virtual classroom, gauge the amount of prep time, and ascertain best practices required for each of these. For example, we found that with most functions, it made drastically more sense to devote some time to setting things up when planning the class rather than on the fly. Even though there is some leeway with doing things on the fly, it could really eat into class time and add unnecessary stress to the live session. We primarily use Microsoft Teams for communication in the library, and it has many apps that work with it. The example above shows Bookings, a scheduling app that we sandbox within the Teams platform. Sandboxing helped us to test things out that we would not have been able to do with an empty virtual conference room. We also used sandboxing to explore video and animation with programs that we wanted to test out and subscribe to on our own. Some examples were trying out video editing programs like Camtasia and iMovie. We also tested animation with programs devoted exclusively to this function, like Animaker and Powtoon, as well as the video and animation features within programs we already used, like Canva, which had both a free version and a Canva Pro subscription with premium features. With the Sandboxing project, we also got to explore accessibility options like captioning, where we could see how well a product auto-captioned, as well as the process and options available to edit these. This was also an opportunity to try out and explore advanced features of products that we were already subscribed to through our institution and worked with our learning management system. Kaltura started out as a video storage application, but has expanded to include video recording and screen capture features. Our sandbox of this product was a good opportunity to test the limits of these capabilities and work with things like editing, captions, integrated quizzes, and embedding into our LibGuides and learning management system. We learned how best to use these features as we gained really practical experience with things like rendering times for the videos, which can take a long time and can be worked around by using other editing software. This was good information to have before working with a deadline. VoiceThread is a robust discussion board alternative that lets you use presentations and other media to create the board material and lets users respond with text, voice, and/or video. Like with Kaltura, learning how to set it up and embed it for the types of projects we would use for classes was very helpful. We also used this method to practice getting out of our comfort zone a bit. When doing a database sandbox, we tried out either a new presentation application or a new feature in a presentation application, like Canva, using music and video within a presentation, as well as Prezi and Genially. Our Pomodoro sandbox let us practice the productivity technique together using Microsoft Teams with cameras on. We tried out various methods, practicing the standard technique as well as experimenting with our individual flexibility and flow. This resulted in our Pomodoro Cafe programming, which has a virtual study hall atmosphere and is an example of Study With Me live streams that students and other organizations produce. Here are some examples of our Pomodoro Cafe menus. We created instructions and schedules for the sessions we moderated and had similar ways of conveying the same information, using different technology so that each is an example of our different takes on this.
We also used resources for our sandboxing projects. In that, we wanted to take a deep dive into our existing resources. The 3 projects that we included were literature lunches, database demos, and reference solutions. So first up, we have literature lunches. We ended up just calling it Lit Lunches. So every semester, our students are assigned a Lit Crit paper in their English 1102 classes. The textbook here is what they use for that class. The library keeps a copy on reserve, and it's heavily used. In fact, the students call it the tree book. So what it is, it's just a huge anthology of poems, plays, stuff like that. But the first half of the book is just short stories. we realized two things about these stories. That number one, we weren't familiar with all of the stories, or number two, we had read them so long ago that we'd forgotten them. Our solution to that was to just read them again, but this time together. We met twice a month for 1 hour. We used Teams with cameras on for these meetings. We discussed each story, each one that was assigned that week. So here we have the stories that we've covered so far. As you can see, there are some classics in there. These are the stories as PDF files in Teams. We use Teams and OneNote to share files. The programs are both Microsoft products, and Georgia State was already using them, so we didn't end up incurring any costs. To make sure we all read the same version of each story, they were scanned and stored in Teams. That means it was also the same version that the students would be reading. As I said before, we kept notes for each story in a shared OneNote file. In there, we broke each entry into 3 sections. So that's themes, search tips, and database tips. This is just a closer look at our OneNote example. You can see that we started with all the themes that we could pull out. Then we listed search tips. And finally, we listed which databases contain info on each story. The outcome for this project had an immediate payoff. So it improved reference services as related to these stories in this book anyway. And the notes save us search time for some of the more obscure stories. Finally, we were more invested in the stories. And I say that because we had definite opinions on every story. For example, we hadn't realized how many of these stories focused on pedophiles and Bible verses. As a result of this, we are now more sensitive to story content. We were thinking that it would be a great idea to include content warnings or trigger warnings on certain stories. Students might feel uncomfortable, at the very least, by some of the content. Also, the stories were more Eurocentric and Christian than we realized. So we understand that this would be an added hurdle for students who are not from those backgrounds. They may not always get the themes or symbolism in the story. Overall, we thoroughly enjoyed this project, and we will continue it in the fall. Our next resource project was database demos. Here, we each selected a separate database, but we all used the same search terms. And those terms were taken from current events at the time. And at that time, it was things like Black Lives Matter, police brutality, social media and free speech, things like that. This time, in this project, the part-time reference staff also joined in. So after we tested the databases, we each gave team presentations detailing the basic functions, the features we liked, and any quirks we ran across. We spread the presentations out over 4 days. That way, we wouldn't be overwhelmed. And this is just an example of the schedule and how we broke that up into those days. The outcome of the database demo was that we were able to identify a few databases that didn't fit our student demographic. And as Amy said before, that's because we serve undergrads on our campus. We were also introduced to various presentation software, and that was because each of us had to use a different version or different presentation software to present. And that's how I decided never to use Sway. And finally, the last project of resources, the team took part in Reference Question Sandbox. Our task was to find 2 solutions for the same question. First, we searched using our personal go-to methods. So that's things like Academic Search Complete, Research Library, whatever your go-to is, the first thing you try. After that search, we searched using a method or a source that we weren't familiar with. So here are the questions we all used for this project. Now the questions were actual GSU student questions. They're from old chat transcripts. Using these questions eliminated the possibility of us choosing easy questions, questions that we already knew the answers to. For this outcome, number 1, we saw search methods that our other team members used. Number 2, we were reminded to offer students sources that they can reach outside of library sources, sources without a paywall. The thinking there was that students won't have access to a lot of these databases after graduation. Thinking of their college to career path, we want them to be able to locate solid information when their bosses ask for it. And number 3, we discovered databases that we were unaware of, or those that we have forgotten from non-use. Now I'll turn it back over to Amy.
So now that you've heard specific examples from Angela and Kristina as to how and when we've used the sandbox, I'd like to share some of our reflections to officially pitch why this could be something that you try with your colleagues by demonstrating that in our case, the pros have heavily outweighed the cons. One advantage of sandboxing is that it adapts to different learning styles and preferences. Most people learn in more than one way, and that preference or learning style is likely to depend on content and interest in the content. Buy-in from the group makes it easier to plug through the unfamiliar and the challenging, which is where all the great learning happens. Another advantage to sandboxing is it has low stakes and a high return on investment. You are setting up all of the parameters. You can change the rules to accommodate an unforeseen issue or a specific need that pops up. And there is enough active learning that your return on investment on a couple of hours is going to be much higher than the equivalent number of hours passively watching a webinar. Sandboxing makes it easy to include part-time colleagues. This also fosters collegiality and builds a culture that development is important and a priority, regardless of how many hours a week someone works. You set the rules so you can adapt as necessary to make this work for anyone on your team. Sandboxing provides peer accountability. This is a group effort which usually, but not always, stalls procrastination and abandonment of projects because you're not working in a silo or a vacuum. Sandboxing gives permission to keep learning. It gives everyone permission to explore and learn and get those items off the maybe one day list because it's a project. Sandboxing requires little to no money. You can do this with things you already have and use, and many products come with some type of trial or educational discount. Another advantage is that sandboxing provides additional presentation skills and practice. Presentations close the loop on the learning because the group is sharing and reflecting. This is useful for all of us, regardless of how long we have been in the profession or how comfortable we are presenting, and ostensibly this is being done in a supportive, safe, and friendly environment. Sandboxing, again, is typically more useful than webinars because it's hands-on, active learning. Even we know that using software or playing in a database stimulates deeper learning than listening to someone talk about it. And have I mentioned sandboxing is adaptable? It can't be overstated that you and your team sets the rules so you can make it fit your needs and interests. Sandboxing stretches individual and collective knowledge. You will initially learn when you work on the self-directed pieces, and then get the benefit of hearing what your colleagues got from the same experience, which is likely to be somewhat different from your own. Sandboxing provides an opportunity to revisit resources. We are all a little guilty of assuming that the tools and resources that we use from day to day are still working the way they did the last time we used them. But when was that? Sandboxing is great for team building and it levels the playing field. Low-stakes learning keeps things safe and fun. It allows people to showcase their strengths, talents, and interests, so it's possible that a newbie librarian has a few things to teach those with a decade plus of experience, which could also help battle some imposter syndrome on both ends of the spectrum. And if you choose to participate, Sandboxing also has great manager and supervisor perks. You get an opportunity to see what your team is good at. You can observe their work and their work process firsthand and see what they are passionate about. It also provides opportunities for everyone on the team to realize that there could be a future collaboration with someone that they don't normally pair off with. It also comes with some disadvantages, and the first one that I think comes to mind for most of us is finding the time. There is a time investment in terms of planning and implementing sandboxing, and making it a priority can be a challenge. It can feel lavish to spend time on this when you have other things that you need to do. Picking a topic can be hard if the team is not in agreement, or your team could be so enthusiastic it might be hard to narrow and to commit to something specific. Another disadvantage is sandboxing can bring to light professional trust issues. Not everyone feels comfortable sharing their pro tips, special sauce, or a skill or knowledge that has become their known area of expertise or brand. It might take a while to get buy-in, and it's also possible not everyone will go all in. However, you do get out what you put in, and you can't let variable effort keep you from trying. There could also be potential budget constraints. This is a very real factor, and as a result, your existing resources may be limiting the amount of sandboxing that you can do. But don't let that discourage you. Get creative and look elsewhere, including on the web. Technology limits can also be a serious disadvantage. As librarians, we are often not given the most cutting-edge computer systems to work with. So it is possible, and probably likely, and in our case this was a definite, that even some web-based tools will require more processing power, or perhaps even equipment that you just don't have. So get creative and ask around. This is where campus collaborations can pay off. Another disadvantage is the rabbit hole, or the syndrome of too many shiny things. Engaged lifelong learners are going to get distracted, and it can be an issue when you lose sight of the original project and spend time on unimportant or non-key parts of the project. Acknowledge this and move on. Look out for one another if you see it happening, and rein it in and continue forward. The graphic shown here is an example that our group experienced when one of our colleagues was creating a technology check intro video to play before online instruction and workshops. And it was meant to have some motion and some music playing so that students could check their microphones and their speakers and their screens and make sure everything was up and running before instruction started. However, what should have been maybe a 30-minute project rolled into a couple of days as our colleague got wrapped into different dance moves, different types of music, what the folks in the video looked like, and so on. So it's going to happen, and we wanted to give a real-world example to show that we're all susceptible to the rabbit hole. Final disadvantages are the learning curve and perfectionism. Don't fear the unknown or let it get in your way. Embrace being uncomfortable. Some people are going to come in to some projects already at an intermediate level, and it can be discouraging for those who may be seeing it for the first time or may still be considered somewhat of a novice. On the flip side, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. Set clear objectives with your team at the start, especially if you know some or much of the team struggles with either of these two. Remember, it's not being broadcast on HBO Max, and no one expects the first couple dozen videos you create to look like lushly produced TED Talks. So what are our next steps? We are currently working in a library-wide LibWizard project for the summer. We opened a sandbox with all of our library colleagues, with the minimum requirement of having at least some familiarity with the SpringShare environment. Everyone who has joined the group is looking to complete a maybe one-day project of their own, or they're using the group to learn more and dig deeper to determine whether there are ways to use the product for future instruction or projects. Looking ahead, because of the adaptability, we have talked about trying out sandboxing for active learning activities, formal and informal assessment, and rethinking and revisiting circulation tasks, tools, and workflows. Thanks again for your time. We hope you've left feeling energized about using our experiences and success to craft some valuable learning and exploring at your home institutions. We have a QR code and a link to our LibGuide here for those of you wanting to look at full-scale examples and possibly learn about some of the free or almost free tools to make what you do easier or more fun.